Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark. Um, it's 11 o'clock, so we'll get cracking. My name is Mark Vale. I'm here to talk to you today about 10 things you should know before you're deploying Microsoft Teams. So if you're in this situation where you haven't yet deployed Teams or you're just beginning it, then hopefully this session will just give you some guidance and some pointers to put the foundations into your deployment to make it a success. Now, this is a completely different session to probably what you've just experienced. I don't have any PowerPoint. This is just me talking. So just to spare you the PowerPoints of death for the entire day, just by doing it a little bit different. So it's a high-level session aimed at just giving you some pointers and some direction of what to think about. You know, some things that I've learned along my journeys deploying teams for organizations around the world, and some of the problems that I've come across, and how to get over those, and hopefully you won't make the same mistakes as I've done in the past. So hopefully this should be good enough for you. The first and most important question that you should really ask yourself, and this goes for any project, is why you're doing the project in the first place. Now, this might sound as though I'm trying to teach you to suck eggs, but it really is an important question that not many end customer IT people really ask before engaging with a partner or deploying Microsoft Teams or any type of product in the organization. It's important because if you don't understand why you want a product such as Teams, then it's very hard for the end users to understand why the product's being deployed and how to use it to get the best out of it. And they're going to be looking to the people who have deployed it to answer those questions. So if you're not prepared for that and you don't know what problems you're solving in the business, then there really is probably no point deploying Teams right now. You need to understand that. So the way that every project should start, you should start with defining a problem statement and looking at ways in which Teams can help with solving those problems within your business, and really take the time to go out and investigate what departments are finding difficult with current IT systems, in particular communication collaboration systems. What's their friction? What do they see as a potential solution to their problems? And if they had to give you 3 things that they would want from a new system, what would they be? Once you've got that information, you have a clearer picture of your landscape and what problems there are within the business, and then you can look to see how Teams can help solve some of those problems, and then write those problems down into a document that defines the project that you're going to live by to deploy Teams. Because a lot of companies and program managers that I've spoken to in the past, when I've asked them why are they deploying Teams, they can't really give me a definitive answer. It's usually, oh, it's the latest and greatest, and it's our strategic direction, and it's Microsoft tells us that this is what we should be doing. And those really aren't good enough answers to be deploying Teams. And what happens is there is no sight of clear project deliverable goals that you need to hit in order to deliver the project. So we end up taking on massive amounts of work trying to fix every business problem going, and then the project just extends and extends. People get upset and what have you, and it just generally doesn't flow, and it doesn't materialize as you'd envisaged at the beginning. So really sort of defining the problem and the solution really into a document helps you deliver the project to those goals. It also helps you to concentrate on fixing the low-hanging fruit. And if you're not familiar with what that phrase means, it means fixing the easy problems first, and then concentrating on buying some time to fix the most complicated ones second. And that allows you as a business and as a partner to help companies and organizations really get the best out of Teams early on. The next real question that you should ask yourself as well is when do you want to deploy Teams? And I don't mean this in a particular date format. I mean this in what sequence of your technical journey to the cloud should you deploy Teams. Now, one of my last or previous engagements with a customer, they wanted to to deploy Teams before any other application in Office 365. So they were coming from another cloud platform into Office 365 for the first time, and they wanted to realize the benefits of Teams straight away. But that caused a lot of problems because, as you understand how Teams works, it relies on underlying Office 365 architecture and tools in order to enable that, enable the functionality within Teams. And if you haven't deployed that correctly, then that's going to have a negative impact on the Teams experience to the users. So really, when you start to think about deploying Teams, you must have a few things in place. Most importantly, obviously, is Azure AD must be set up. And if you've got an Office 365 tenant, then you probably already got that set up. But then you want to consider deploying, if you haven't already, Exchange Online, because Teams operates with Exchange Online. It doesn't really operate with Exchange on premises or a mailbox that's on premises. I'll come on to reasons to why that's why that's the case later. Users also need to be really using OneDrive for Business because the way Teams shares files is kind of different to how Skype for Business and other UC platforms share files. So if you think about how Skype shares a file, it's an actual almost FTP transfer between two endpoints. So computer to computer and now have two documents in two different places. With Microsoft Teams, what happens is if I want to share a file with you, I will then, once I click the share file button, that document gets uploaded to my OneDrive for Business folder, and a share link is then given out to you so you can access that document from my OneDrive for Business account. So the document isn't actually transferred between two computers. I only have one version of the document available. So in order to have that file sharing and collaboration experience, OneDrive for Business must absolutely be enabled and in use before you start thinking about Teams. And moving on from the technology as well, it really is just Azure AD, Exchange, OneDrive for Business, by the way, and then you can start thinking about deploying Teams. But moving beyond the technology, you need to define your personas. So what I mean by that is the communication profile or the collaboration profile you want to assign to each type of user in your business. Now, typically, you can have as many personas as you want, but typically an organization will have just a handful, maybe 5 sort of configuration buckets, if you want to call them something different, that each user or every user from their organization can fit into one of those. And when they fit into one of those buckets, they then get a standard set of equipment, they get a standard set of policies and configuration and feature options within an application that match the design of that configuration bucket or persona. Now, typically, when we look at a Skype deployment, or when I look at a Skype deployment, we really have 3, maybe 4 different types of users. We have users who just use instant messaging and presence, and they may join a meeting, and they may rarely organize a meeting. So we have those, the more like frontline type workers. We also have workers who sit in the middle that will do instant messaging and quite a lot of meetings, some federated chat and what have you, peer-to-peer calling, some video. And then we'll have the enterprise voice users, and those are typically split between a standard enterprise voice user, which is just basic PSTN connectivity, to more complex cases where we think about hunt groups and IVRs and call centers and what have you. So those are those are the sort of 4 main buckets that we tend to see through different deployments with different customers. And then it's about how do you translate those users into a persona for Teams. Now, if we go back to take on or target the low-hanging fruit first, then the users who are using Skype for Business or another chat platform just for instant messaging and presence capability, it makes sense to move those users to Teams, because in so doing, you're not diminishing their user experience. You're moving a large portion potentially of your user base to Teams really quickly, because it's only chat. And then if it's not peer-to-peer audio, we don't have any network well, when I say any network considerations, but we don't have it to the same extent as if we're doing voice. And those can realize the benefit of Teams, quite quickly. Coming on to network assessment and sort of some of the technical challenges that you will come across when you start to deploy Teams in this manner. Obviously, the network is going to be the most critical thing that you're going to need to look at from a voice perspective or a video perspective. And the way that Teams operates now is slightly different to how an on-premises UC platform would normally use your network. So every Teams meeting, and so to classify what a Teams meeting is, this meeting that we're in now, also if we're having a three-way conversation, that's a Teams meeting. So instead of all the media going from the client to a server in your data center, all the media is going from all your clients in your organization to Microsoft Teams in the cloud, and that obviously puts a stress on your internet connectivity lines. It depends on how you're set up for your internet egress. We've got proxy servers we need to contend with. We need to be bypassing proxy servers for media traffic. Also, other technical challenges is that I've come across with regards to security. So it's different levels of security, information security and network security. So obviously we're now sending communication out over the public internet, and security department are going to want to know and be confident that that is suitably protected. So we can obviously say that the media is encrypted with AES, and it can't be decrypted by anybody in the middle. And then information security, which I'll come on to in a moment, is more about how to protect documents from being leaked out of the business. And what we typically find, what I found in the past, is that these policies that are put in place by the security and information security people can sometimes be, I want to say, out of date, but geared towards an on-premises type of deployment versus cloud. And a lot of my time has been talking to information security people about how their policy might need to change a little bit to accommodate the cloud. The third thing you need to do before you even start deploying Teams, obviously, is prepare your network and devices. So in terms of network assessment, we have a Microsoft tool that gives you some basic network and test connectivity. If you want to do a full network assessment, then we have tools from, I think it's IR Prognosis, do a tool that allows you to simulate your expected media and conferencing workload over your network to see if your network is performing all the way to the Microsoft Edge as within the limits of what Microsoft recommend. Also, hardware and devices, the endpoint is very important. So when we go and talk to customers who want to go and deploy Teams, they rarely give a consideration to the device the user is using. So at a minimum level, we really should be looking at Windows 10. There is some Windows 7 support, but we really should be on Windows 10 as a baseline. But more importantly, the headsets. Businesses don't really account for budget for headsets, and they go, well, it's okay because these users aren't having enterprise voice, they don't need a headset. Well, we're deploying meetings and there's peer-to-peer audio, everyone needs a headset. Even people who aren't enabled for peer-to-peer audio will need a headset, because if they're invited to a Teams meeting, they will need some way of connecting their ears and their mouth to that meeting. And using uncertified devices, it's just a complete no-no. I just had a conversation before I came on this session with a customer who hadn't thought about devices, and it was exactly the same conversation I've just sort of explained now. It's like, well, they can use their laptop speakers and microphone, or they can use their Apple earbuds and what have you. Well, yes, they can, but the audio quality is going to be compromised as a result of that. And if you have multiple people in the same room, in the same meeting, using laptop speakers and mics, then you're going to get media loops and what have you. So it really sets, if you haven't budgeted for certified headsets to be deployed to all your users who are going to be using Teams right now, then that's something you definitely need to be doing, because what will happen is that the users will complain that Teams isn't working properly, and the project and Teams will fail as an application because the users will blame the application on the computer, not how they're interfacing or interacting with that application. And that is really hard to come back with and win end user support back from that situation. So we really need to give them the best tools for the job. More importantly, next thing you need to look at, is compliance and governance. And this leads on from the information security element. So why is compliance and governance needed in a UC platform? Well, Teams is not a UC platform, it's a UC and collaboration platform. And it brings a new element of collaboration and this group collaboration, team-based workspace that we haven't experienced before from a Microsoft perspective. And that then introduces some challenges of how information is shared between users within an organization and also with external people as well. And it really has brought a focus on how to protect information inside documents and how to protect chats and people from talking to each other or accidentally sharing that type of information. So we can do this in Teams in a number of ways. So for compliance, Exchange Online is used for chats, personal chat compliance. And what happens is when you send a chat in Teams, it first gets written into your device memory, then sent off to a database service in Azure, which then gets a conversation or a thread ID, and then that message then is delivered to the recipient of that chat. And that works all in near real time. But that service alone doesn't allow for HR people to interrogate those types of conversations. So what Microsoft have is a back-end synchronization service, which takes those chats and syncs them to your Exchange Online mailbox. And they use that chat history, which is a hidden folder inside the chat history folder in your mailbox. They use that with eDiscovery to interrogate chats and to, for compliance or for legal proceedings if necessary. This doesn't work with Exchange on premises. So if you have an Exchange on premises mailbox that's not in hybrid, then you don't have any compliance for personal chats. You will have for any chats that are in the Teams element of Teams, so in the group collaboration, that chat history is stored to the group mailbox, which will definitely be in Exchange Online. But if you haven't got hybrid in place and your mailbox is on-prem, your personal mailbox, peer-to-peer chats aren't recorded for compliance reasons. If you are in hybrid, then what happens is, I forget the term, but basically if the mailbox is on-prem for the user, like a shadow mailbox is created in the cloud, which Teams uses to dump all its chats into that mailbox, which allows eDiscovery to work. And then if you move that user's mailbox into the cloud, it's all merged into one mailbox. Protecting information being leaked out of the organization is the next step. And we can use data loss prevention policies within Compliance and Security Center in Office 365 to not only prevent documents being shared to people that they shouldn't, but also stopping chats as well. So the way that DLP works is that you create a policy and a search criteria or a criteria that matches a condition, and you say if somebody sends a message that contains this string or regex or whatever it might be, or tries to send a document with some sensitive information in that matches this string, then stop it from happening. And that can be done inside and between users inside the business for chat, and also between users inside the business and to external. It can actually stop the document from being shared. It also gives you the ability to coach those users who trigger that policy to say, hey, you know what, I don't know if you noticed, but that document had some kind of code in it. You probably shouldn't have been sharing it with that person. We've stopped it. If you think this is erroneous on our part, please click here to escalate it. But going beyond that, what happens if somebody sends a document that doesn't match a DLP string? Well, if you have external sharing enabled, then that document will pass a DLP policy and get sent out to the destination. What can you do to protect those types of documents? Well, you can use what's called Azure AD Rights Management Services, which is a bolt-on to Azure Information Protection. So you can classify documents in whatever classification you want. Let's say it's top secret, and you can then put an encryption policy with RMS on that type of document to say only these people in this group or in this list are able to open, edit, or copy or paste, or whatever it might be, that document. So even if I do send that document to somebody who's not authorized, even they'll receive that document, but when they open it, it will prevent them from accessing the data because they won't be authenticated with RMS. So that's another protection that we can put in place to stop information leaking out of the business. Information leaking inside the business, if you have an organization that has maybe an R&D and a sales arm, and you want to protect research and development from salespeople to protect your IP, then we can use what's called information barriers within teams to basically create an ethical wall, a brick wall between those two groups of users. So they won't be able to communicate with each other, and they won't be able to share documents with each other, and that is usually used in more sort of the finance sector and some of the bigger manufacturing companies. But it is there for you to use. The last bit on governance is there is this concept of how teams should be used, and there's various opinions on the internet of who should be allowed to create a team in your organization. Should IT control the creation of teams, or should it be left to the end user? Or should it be something in between where an end user can request a team to be created, and then there's an approval mechanism in place that goes through to approve the creation of that team? Now, I kind of sit on the fence with this. I can see the benefits of governance in that for a company who is new to teams, who wants to provide that level of security around group creation to stop lots of teams being created for no particular reason. But on the other hand, if you left it to the users, the whole point of teams is to enable the end user to work collaboratively better with each other. And they're going to be more qualified to decide how they want to work with each other than somebody sitting in IT or in a management position, perhaps. And sometimes it's better to let those users find their own way, because then what you find is that they then solve some of the problems that we haven't even thought about, and they will work in their own way. And sometimes that's better to let teams self-regulate, and we can do things like expiration policies on teams. So if you're worried about having thousands and thousands of groups called test, or groups that start and then just die away, there's no activity, then we can put an expiration policy onto teams to say every 90 days, the team owner, or however many days, the team owner has to click, I still want this team, in order for it to be there for the next 90 days or however many. And if they don't click it, then the team gets deleted. So, and that notification is delivered to the team owner's mailbox, so they will get it in Teams and in an email, and they'll have so many days to react to that request. So that could be a way of introducing teams to say, look, we've got this platform. It allows you to collaborate in however you want. Go and fill your boots, but we're going to put some soft management around it by asking you to confirm that you still want that team in 90 days time. The fully governed way, of course, is stopping everybody from creating a team and only having an approved list of users who can do that. And then what that would mean is that in order to get a team built, there would need to be a service desk ticket usually, and then a service management approval process to get that team built. But then that process could be so long that actually it hinders the point of, or the reason why the team was requested in the first place. And sort of the middle ground, you can use things like Microsoft Flow to build a form that a user can fill out. I need a new team, and that can then get sent to their manager or an approver. They can approve the request, and then a team can be provisioned off the back of that using Microsoft Flow and some an interaction with the Graph API and what have you. So there is no right answer or wrong answer to how you want to approach Teams creation. It's entirely up to you, and you should just pick what works for you or what you think will work for you. Guest access is a new feature, and it's probably quite an important point for anybody who wants to extend collaboration beyond their internal organization. So when guest access was first released, people confused this with federation. So to be completely clear, federation is one-to-one chat with a particular person in another organization. Once that chat is complete, you have no reason to talk to them and collaborate with them until the next time you have a reason to. What guest access does is it invites a user from another organization into your tenant and into that team, and they then become a member or a guest member of that team that they've been invited to. Now, why would you use guest access over federation or vice versa? Well, to give you an example, if you wanted to chat to a supplier to see where an order was, you would use federation because you would fire a message over to them to say, I'm just chasing an update for this order. Can you give me an update, please? And they would respond, yes, here's the update. And you'd use guest access for a scenario where perhaps you're looking for skills in a certain area and you have an external contractor come in, or a partner that you want to engage with on a more regular basis as a project. Then guest access would be probably the most suitable one, because it allows them, the partner or the guest, to come into your tenant, into that team, and participate in collaboration chats with your team members, co-author on documents if necessary. And it's more about staff augmentation and them working many hours with you to deliver a project in that team space. This also, by default, guest access in Azure AD, if you haven't set it up any different, allows any members of your organization to invite guests into any team that they're an owner or a member of. And obviously, this can be like at hotmail.com, at Gmail address, at any address. And that can be a bit of an alarming thing for people to hear. So if you're going to deploy guest access, and this is a thing that you need to do, then you have a few ways in which you can control this. So the first way in which you can control this is that you can enforce the guest inviter role in Azure AD. And you can set it up so that no members or nobody in your Azure AD, other than people who are members of the guest inviter role, can invite external people into the tenant. Beyond that, you can choose from a an Azure AD whitelist or blacklist. A whitelist basically allows guests to be invited from any domain that you list in the whitelist. And obviously a blacklist is to disallow anybody in that blacklisted domain an invite to your tenant, but allow anybody else. You can't have a whitelist and blacklist running at the same time. It is one or the other, so you have to choose which model is best for you. Most people go for a whitelisted option, and they then go and gather the domains that they want to allow guest access with. It is a full domain whitelist, so we can't do specific email addresses or specific people from that domain. It is anybody within that domain. Beyond that, we can turn guest access off completely for Teams if we needed to, or we can disallow guest access to certain teams. So within Teams, stupid sentence. Anyway, so this is a post-team creation task. So if you have guest access on, but you want to permit restrict one particular team from being able to invite guests into that team, even if there is a user inside that team who has the guest inviter role, then you can apply some PowerShell restrictions through Azure AD to prevent guest access invites to that team. It is a post-creation method. It's not something that you can sort of set once and it's just done. So if that's something that you're going to need, then that will probably mandate that you need some kind of governance over Teams creation. Number 6 is modes. So you may have heard people talk about Skype for Business only mode, Teams only mode, and every mode in between mode, and Islands mode. So what these are, Microsoft created different client experiences within Teams to fit certain types of scenarios. And typically, the way that they've approached this is a organization coming from another platform into Teams approach, and an organization coming from Skype for Business to Teams approach. Now, if you're coming from another platform, whether it be Cisco, Jabber, or what have you, into Teams, then you don't have to worry about modes because there's no interop between Teams and Jabber. So in this sense, you set your tenant default to Teams only, and you never have to worry about modes. But if you're coming from Skype for Business to Teams, then you really need to understand what modes there are and how they're used and which of the modes is best to use. Now, anybody using Skype for Business today, you have a choice, and this goes back to defining your personas of how they transition to Teams. So going back to the low-hanging fruit and going back to the people who just used chat and maybe peer-to-peer calling, some federated chat perhaps, they don't really use meetings, they don't have any enterprise voice. Then take them from Skype for Business only mode and put them in Teams only mode, because there is no reason for them to be hanging around on Skype for Business when all their functionality can be delivered through Teams. And by doing so, we now have 2 groups of users left, people who use Skype and meetings and people who use Skype meetings and enterprise voice. The next group that you probably want to move is the Skype people that use meetings. Now you can do this, you can look at this in a bigger context, and you can then say, well, actually, I want to move my meetings from Skype for Business into Teams. So I can actually move my Skype and Skype meetings people into Teams only mode, because again, all their services can be serviced by Teams. This leaves now my enterprise voice users on Skype for Business. Should they be excluded from using anything in Teams? Well, no. I mean, they can use Teams to a certain degree, but what we have to consider is that the user, typically in all of our journeys up to now, are used to using one client for one thing. And when we migrate them to a new platform or a new version, they're used to being told that on a certain date, this client will cease and you will use this other client for all your stuff. That's what they're used to. If you suddenly give them two clients that can do broadly the same thing, they don't really know which ones to use. And I'll come on to maybe talk about islands mode and how that is probably a bad idea, maybe after this point. But how do you get your Skype for Business enterprise voice users to use Teams in the most effective way? Well, at the moment, you might not have direct routing in place, and there might need to be some more further testing involved. So you can't move all their workloads into Teams, but you can certainly move their meetings into Teams and make everybody have a meeting experience in one platform. That then gives you the ability to upgrade your Skype rooms and your other video conferencing rooms to Teams rooms and have a single platform, single user experience for meetings while you figure out how to move the most complicated users. When a user is in Skype for Business collaboration and meetings mode, they will continue to use Skype for Business for their instant messaging and chat. They'll still continue to use Skype for Business for peer-to-peer audio and video, screen sharing, and also federated communication with external people. They'll be able to use Teams for collaboration, so they'll see the Teams app inside Teams. They won't see the chat app, so they will be restricted from seeing the chat app. And they'll also see their calendar, so they can have a meeting experience in Teams, and they have their UC and instant messaging experience and voice experience in Skype for Business. In so doing this, it means that interop between the different personaed people, so the people who are now fully in Teams and Skype for Business, it still means that they were able to chat with each other, get presence from each other. They're able to call each other. It works over native interop. It's a much cleaner process. They know that when they chat to Brendan on Teams, it's going to a Skype for Business person because it says it's going to Skype for Business. The problem we have with Islands mode, the problem I have with Islands mode, is that that consistency is missing. So what Islands mode means is that you have Skype for Business and all its functionality, and you have Teams and all its functionality, and you have the same user available in both worlds. Now, when you start to move people over to Teams, what's naturally going to happen is that when they want to search and communicate with a user, it's going to look inside Teams. It's not going to realize that Brendan is actually using his Skype for Business client and he hasn't got Teams open. You know, to the person who wants to talk to Brendan or chat to Brendan, it's a Teams conversation. And then Brendan's got to then open up Teams and respond to them. So he might open up Teams, respond, and close it back down. And then he might get a missed notification that there's been a response to that chat. And he might just then choose to respond in Skype for Business to that person. And what happens then is there's missed chats going on in multiple places, and it's a really negative experience for the users. So, and then also moving from islands to another mode can take up to, well, I've experienced up to 3 days for everything to settle down. So we have this this wait period in the cloud right now with Teams that every change takes 24 hours maximum to replicate through Office 365. It can also take a number of hours for those settings to reach the client for on the end user's machine. But more importantly, it also takes even longer for that setting to then replicate round to everybody else. So what I've had experienced in the past is that we've moved people from islands mode to Teams only mode, and people have been chatting to users in Skype. When we transitioned them into Teams, the chat experience, because Teams has a chat history, when they try and reply to that thread, it's already set up chat routing between the two participants. It takes ages for that routing to update to what the setting is. So what we get then is failed deliveries, and people are saying, well, I was able to talk to Brendan yesterday, now I can't. Why? And the only way I've been able to fix this is by clearing the Teams cache on everybody's machine, or the two people's machines, and force the Teams client to go back and pull the settings from the cloud. So what I found is that it can take 24 hours for your settings to apply in the tenant. It can take 24 hours for those settings to get into the target's user's machine, but then also the Teams cache. I think it updates every like 48 hours or something. So there's that time lag as well. And if we've got a cached conversation on other people's machines, we have some communication challenges around that. So those are the reasons why I hate Islands mode. I'm sorry, I'm not going to lie. And going from and using the Skype modes and going to Teams only modes, that type of migration path is much more smoother. It means that there's only one change ever to the chat and call routing table. And it doesn't matter whether you flick a user from Skype for Business only to Skype for Business and Collab, or Skype for Business with meetings. That never breaks the chat from a Teams only person to a Skype person, or vice versa. And then when we go from a Skype version to a Teams only person, then there's only 24 hours before Teams realizes that that person is no longer in Skype for Business. They're now fully in Teams only mode, and let's just forget that conversation. So what happens then is, once you've moved a user into Teams only mode, the old conversation goes into your recent chat history as a Skype history, and a new history is created, which is then going to be a new Teams only chat history, and then it's a much smoother transition for users. So when we talk about Skype for Business as well, interop and coexistence with Teams, we also need to think about hybrid. So if you have a Skype for Business deployment right now and you want to leverage Teams, you need to deploy hybrid configuration as a minimum. If you don't have hybrid, then it's going to be very hard, if not very disruptive, to move from Skype for Business to Teams, because we'll have split domain spaces, and that will break not only Skype for Business federated chat with any of your external people who are using Teams or Skype for Business Online still. It will also stop people inside your organization who are in Teams chatting or calling to your Skype for Business people. The coexistence and interop experience, you should try and keep that down to a small time frame as possible. Don't try and think that it's going to be a long-term strategy for you. Microsoft's made it perfectly clear that the strategic option is Teams for everything. I appreciate that there are some workloads that can only be serviced with Skype for Business still. So you need to choose your time to migrate to Teams, and going back to those modes, using those Skype modes and those Teams modes effectively can help you achieve that. Once you're inside Teams, the user experience is pretty slick, but there are some nuances, some differences, particularly with federation, that you need to be aware of and articulate to your end users. So in Teams, there are two types of federation models, and that depends in what modes both parties are in. So coming out is what's called Federation version 2, well, that's just the name I've given it, whereby if you're in Teams only mode and the person you're trying to communicate with externally is in Teams only mode, then you get a native Teams chat experience with file share, Giphies, and all the fun stuff that you can do in Teams. However, if that federated user is using Skype for Business in any of the Skype modes, then that federation experience is going to be dumbed down to chat, peer-to-peer audio, and peer-to-peer video. You have the ability to right now to do screen share, but what that means is when somebody screen shares from Teams to Skype, the Skype person is going to be invited to a Teams meeting. So it's not going to be a native client-to-client experience for screen share. So it is a much limited, or much more limited federation experience. And there's no real way for a user to understand what's going to happen until they initiate that federated chat. So it's not something that we can say, well, if you contact this person, it's going to be this experience, or you contact that person, it's going to be a different experience. So that's just something to put to your adoption teams to say, in these situations under federated conditions, these are the two scenarios that users might find themselves in. It is expected behavior. My last 2 points are going to be on phone system and phone options. So if you are thinking of using Microsoft Teams as a phone system, then you obviously have a few options. So if you're in one of the 12, I think, countries that Microsoft have calling plans, you can then purchase a phone system from Microsoft and some phone numbers and start using Teams as a phone system. But most organizations are going to be looking at what's called direct routing. And following on from this session, Randy Chapman's going to be deep diving into direct routing. And that essentially allows you to bring your own SBC to Microsoft Teams. So if you have an SBC for Skype for Business and it's on the certified list, like a ribbon or an audio codes box, Oracle, AnyNode, I think, the 4 providers, then you can, subject to a firmware update and license potentially, you can use those devices to connect to Teams. And then you can use your existing PSTN connectivity on premises to then route calls into Teams and use it as a phone system. Direct routing also opens up a new market and something that maybe you've not considered yet, and that's hosted direct routing, where you go to a telecoms provider and they will host an SBC in maybe Azure or their data center and provide you PSTN connectivity that way. And that allows you then to deploy Microsoft Teams phone system to almost any country in the world, provided you've got connectivity in that country, of course. That then produces some media optimization questions that you should ask yourself. So in certain challenging countries, China, for instance, where they have the Great Firewall of China, and we can't really guarantee that media is going to be filtered or not filtered, we have this challenge of how do we ensure a good experience to those users. Well, we could deploy it on premises, SBC connected to a local Chinese circuit, and then we could enforce media bypass as well, so that any Chinese people using direct routing will keep their media inside China and not use the Microsoft media processors or transport relays as a first port of call, which then optimizes the media. The second point is, if we go to challenging countries like India, we have regulations, and we can then, Microsoft Teams supports toll bypass limitations, so we can then enforce people to use a local SBC versus more regional based deployments. The last point is that it's just to understand how media is relayed between an endpoint and your tenant. So if your tenant is in the EU, then all the media processors and transport relays are hosted inside the EU country. But the way that Microsoft get around this is that they leverage their global Azure network, and they have peerings inside pretty much every major country in the world. And when you establish media through transport relays, what happens is that based on your client's public IP address, it will connect to the nearest Microsoft POP to that country, and then relay the media over their network to wherever the transport relay is in Microsoft. You really won't know because they use Anycast. But when you look at the trace between your client and Microsoft, there is literally like 2 hops from your router into Microsoft. So you're going from your edge to your ISP straight into Microsoft. And at that point, all the voice is managed and optimized by Microsoft. So we're not using the internet for a really long leg between, say, Singapore and Ireland. We're using a managed network for that. Well, that's all I have. Probably last few minutes for any questions before Randy gets going. So thank you very much for listening to me ramble.